It's time for Sewing with Nancy, with me, Mary Malari, serving as guest host while Nancy takes a break. Today it's the second part of the series, Applique Large and Small. To begin, I'll show you how to combine fabric scraps on mesh fabric to create an artistic piece to applique. This project is perfect for quilters and seamsters who save their leftover chips, even the ones too small to really save. Anyone can be an applique artist with bits and pieces of fabric. Applique, large and small, that's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. Amazing designs and Class A needles.
This collection of fabric scraps really is probably too small to save, except for this project, Applique Chips. And we looked earlier at this shirt, which has chip over the edges of the front collar and the back neckline, as well as on the two cuffs. I didn't try to get each cuff to be exactly the same. I just used a lot of the same type of fabrics. This is a very artistic look that anyone really can do with some chips. So today the project will be to make a display of chips for the collar of a shirt. And here the collar is exposed, and what we'll do first of all, this is so important, is to pin in place a piece of mesh fabric. Now this is very sheer, but it's strong, and it also endures ironing very well. So an iron at any heat will not melt the mesh. So I'm pinning it over the collar, and now I'm going to build my display of chips. This can take a long time, or you can kind of just sort of throw this together just as you see fit. You can overlap, you can add yarn, you can make the chips bigger, smaller. It's very inventive, and you really are the artist here. So we'd work our way all the way across the collar, and you can leave gaps. It's just whatever you feel that you'd like to do. So when you have your complete display built, then you add another very important piece here, and that would be a piece of water-soluble stabilizer. This too is very sheer, and you're going to place this on top, but carefully, because you don't want anything to move. And now your pinning will be through 3 layers. It will be through mesh, through chips, and through the water-soluble. And I just happen to have this already done right below. And so here is my display of chips. I'm going to take this next to the sewing machine, and I'm going to use clear top thread, though for today's purposes we're going to use a darker thread so you can see what crazy stitching I'm doing here all over the place. I want to catch all of these things in the corners, the edges, so that they're a solid unit. Then after I think I've done enough sewing, I'm going to get rid of the water-soluble stabilizer by cutting away the bigger pieces, and then I'm going to wet this whole piece and get rid of the residue. And after I've done that, I have this piece. Here the stabilizer is totally gone, and the mesh is here, but I've already begun to trim away some of the mesh. And now this piece is the applique section I'll sew around the edges to my collar of my shirt. This is the big project, and applique chips in a smaller version is here on this bird's nest. Here my chips are really tiny and very skinny, and they kind of have rough edges so that they're an interesting nest. Other samples just show you some of the possibilities for applique chips. Building appliques at the serger is not the usual way to use this machine, but the uniform and noticeable edging adds another feature. Here's a project idea. Showcased is a small butterfly on a child's apron. This may be your discovery of a new way to use your serger. It seems as if all of the serger designs have an added dimension because the edges are not totally sewn in place. This is an awfully easy way to create an applique design, and we start with rectangles of fabric with lightweight interfacing on the back. I've serged the 4 edges, and normally now I would use my fray stopping liquid on each corner and letting this dry, and it dries clear, then I can safely cut off the thread tails. Although some people do like to keep them there just because they add another element of interest. Once the threads are cut, now I've folded this in half and I've sewn a seam through both layers, and I'm going to form now a pleat in the center. And this next sample shows that pleat stitched in place. So all you have to do next is to cut out the shape of the butterfly body and sew that down, and you have another butterfly on this apron. Very simple. So we move next to another easy shape, and that happens to be strips of fabric. And here I have a piece of silk. I like fabrics that have nice, both back and front sides are nice. And if they're not nice, you can use 2 coordinating fabrics with the right sides exposed. Now you would twist the strips, and then you would place them as a decoration on something like this small tote. And I've used buttons to hold the ends in place, and then my secret attachment method, which I've often shown here on Sewing with Nancy before, is golden and silver metallic fasteners to hold the shank buttons in place. But I do know how to sew, and so on this evening purse I have silk strips that are twisted, and I sewed down the ends of each of the strips. Then we move to squares and leaves. I stay with simple shapes when I'm using the serger for appliques because circles are just a little too hard to do in a nice way. So to build the design that's here on this t-shirt, the flower and the 3 leaves, we start with a square for the flower, and I have one cut out again with the fusible interfacing on the back. And my next sample shows how I've serged the 4 sides, and I've already trimmed away the extra thread tails. Then to form the flower, to give the dimension, I'm going to create a small pleat in the horizontal side of the square, and then vertically another a 1/4 inch pleat. And now I've formed that square into something with edges that rise. And I would base this in place, and then I'd place it on my garment and sew it to the garment. But we need leaves also because this is, after all, a floral display. So the shape of the leaf is in the resource material along with the flower center. And here the leaf is outlined on the fabric, and this is these gentle curves are easy to serge, and this is cleaned up with the thread tails. And to give dimension to the leaves, we'll make a small pleat here, and then we'll sew down the pleat so it stays in place. I always like to say that this dark fabric might not be your choice at home, but here on television you can see pretty well what we're doing. So we build our leaves and our flowers and add it to the t-shirt. But we have yet one more shape, and that's the triangle. And they too are easy to serge. And here on the knit top, there's a whole neckline full of triangles that have been serged, sewn to the neckline, and then a little button is added to each one so that it holds the end of the triangle in place. Then we clean up the neckline with a piece of bias across the back, and we're all set with appliques, triangles, squares, and strips, large and small. A small applique design can be attractive and interesting on its own, but it takes on added prominence when it gets framed. There are many ways to build frames, not with wood, but with fabric. The techniques are easy, clever, and attractive. And here we have a very simple applique design. It's an interesting heart in that it's sort of asymmetrical and not equally shaped. And I have it stitched here on just a piece of fabric. And it's okay, but when I turn that piece of fabric into an on-point square, and I buttoned the frame onto my apron with 4 unique buttons, which I have to admit I pinned in place so I can move my square if I want to. This is a very simple way to frame that simple design. And we move next to my friend here, the dress form, where I have the same heart design in the center of 4 blocks of fabric. I fused them onto the sweatshirt, and I used 30-weight cotton thread and black thread because I wanted to bring the color of the sweatshirt into the color of the squares. So we make that little heart design look lots more interesting and prominent here with a frame of this type. Our next idea for framing is here on a tote bag. Well, at first, though, it's just the simple design that suggests a leaf with a stem. And I've fused it on, I've sewed around the edges, and I have a little trim on my tote, but really I'm much happier with this design after I got it framed. And this is a collection of fabrics. It's fun to dig into your stash and put together a conglomeration. I sewed my leaf design to the orange piece, and then I added strips of trim. I added another piece of fabric, the light orange, and then the black and white also has a strip of rickrack across the bottom. So you put together elements things you have on hand, and you can build a really interesting piece. So we're going to do that for the apron that's here that really needs some help. And this pink apron has the parts of, we're going to add some bold colors. And actually we are going to build the design on a piece of stabilizer. This is tearaway stabilizer, and this will be sewn to the apron as the base, but we're going to add a similar shaped chunk of fabric here, and we're going to add our pocket, or it could just be a patch of fabric. We might add this at a slant. Not everything, again, has to be straight up and down or centered. Now, I found 2 interesting pieces of trim, and they actually kind of dictated the color choices of the fabrics that we put together here. And so I might add strips of these to my design. And after I've sewn together on the stabilizer and ripped away the excess, then I'm going to sew the block of purple to the apron front. And I think I'm going to have a pretty interesting large-scale applique design. So another way to frame a design. Texture adds appeal to applique designs, and surfaces look more interesting with a few wrinkles. By stitching fabric to a specialty fabric designed to shrink, we have an easy way to produce appliques with distinctive style, whether they're large or small. And here I have the small version, which is a book cover for a journal. The flower and the bud are both more interesting because they've been wrinkled and they're going to stay wrinkled. This is a permanent process. To build this design, which is you also see in large form here on the dressmaker, the dressmaking form, we have a much larger flower, much larger scale. And I'll show you how to put this design together. Here at the light box, I have my design traced, and I'm going to trace next on paperback fusible web. Now, I'm going to trace and number each of the leaves so that I can put this together in the right order. And now that I've traced these shapes, I can fuse them to the wrong side of my applique fabric, which is a knit fabric, and then I can cut them out and put them together. Here on the applique pressing sheet, which looks like plastic but really is a substance that allows you to iron on it, I have the leaves positioned, and I'm just going to slip the stem over the top. And I could at this point fuse this in place with the iron, except I'm missing yet my flower and the bud design. And so to make those wrinkles, I'm going to do a little sewing first. And this sewing is standard fabric such as cotton or silk. And on the back is the specialty fabric, which is the one that's going to shrink. And when I take this to the iron and have steam on, you'll see what will happen. With the steam, it's kind of a magical thing, and you spend a little time steaming and creating the wrinkles. So you'd be a little patient here, but this is really fun. And these wrinkles are permanent, so they're not going to become undone. So we have this partially wrinkled at this point, but my other sample is totally done, and this is what I would use to cut out the applique design. So I trace my flower on the wrong side, and then I stitch very on the line of the flower, and then I cut out very close to the stitching line. This will allow me to get a nice applique edge on the flower so that there won't be a lot of raveling. I do the same also for the bud. And then I've got the design put together. I can bring it to the iron, fuse everything together, and then put it on display on a tote bag, a garment, or any item of your choice. The classic chevron pattern creates a striking applique design, easily covering large spaces such as pillow covers. Learn an easy way to cut the chevron shapes from fabric fused with paper-backed fusible web, and use the technique for small travel bags or larger projects. So here is the small project that you just saw, and on this side of the bag I've used black thread and a decorative machine stitch to secure the edges of the chevron shapes. But on the other side, just because I wanted to make that different, I've fused these in place and I sewed on the edges with clear monofilament thread, so the stitching is not obvious, and sometimes you like that look as well for appliques. Now, to create something like this, we're going to take the easy way out, and my sample here shows a collection of chevron strips on a neutral base, and these are batik type ombre fabrics that are very interesting when we cut chevrons from them. I'm going to cut a base fabric, and then I will cut an equal size of my applique fabric, and I have paperback fusible web on the back. And now to create the folds, I'm going to start at one end and create accordion type folds, but I don't want all of the edges all the folds to match up. That will make it easier to cut the chevron shapes. And you can be, you make this kind of extreme or as close to regular as possible. So you see here how none of those folds really line up very much. On my next sample, which I have already marked with pleats, I have numbered drawn lines for each of the chevrons, and I've numbered each one. That way, when it comes time to add the chevrons to my base fabric, I kind of know the order. So I'll take my clip off and cut the first chevron, and you can do this at the rotary cutting mat if you prefer, or you can use scissors as I'm doing here. And my strips of chevron are of different widths. That's just because I can. And so I would take off the paperback fusible web and fuse this into place, and I'd follow it up with the next chevron. I would match, if number 1 starts here, I want number 2 over here, and so forth, to fill the space with the chevron designs. Now, the large sample of chevrons is shown here on the pillow. And if this looks different to you, it's because the edges of some of the chevron shapes have yarn, which is couched over the top. And this is a very easy technique with clear nylon thread and yarn. And so we take the yarn and sew it over the edges. So here you see that I'm adding yarn to the sample. I'm adding the pink yarn to the edges of several of the chevron strips. It's another way to add texture and interest and dimension, and you're going to really like cutting out these easy chevrons. Welcome to the Nancy's Corner segment. I'm Mary Malari, guest host for this series. Our Nancy's Corner guest is a member of the Navajo Nation and pays tribute to her ancestors through quilting. Please welcome Susan Hudson, who joins us via Skype from Sorrel Sky Gallery in Durango, Colorado. Hello, Susan, and you're going to introduce yourself in a unique way.
Iyate, my name is Susan Hudson. I'm born for Dakiani Dene. and born of the Nakaidene. Okay.
That's our most unique introduction so far. The quilt that you have on display behind you has a lot of stories to tell, and I wonder if you'd share with the viewers what the meanings of the designs and the significance of your prize-winning quilt.
What I did was I wanted to honor my ancestors because of them going to the boarding school and how they learned how to quilt. So that's what I did. I wanted to turn that negative into a positive. And what I also wanted to do was to show where I came from, that I came from Nirvana. And also he was one of our great leaders. And also my three grandmothers that survived the long walk of the Navajos that came back. And one of my grandmothers is the oldest documented Navajo weavers, down to Hosteen Claw. He's one of they call him the master Navajo weaver, and Mary Wheelwright, and she built a museum around him in Santa Fe. And also I have Mary Ann Foster. She's another master weaver. And of course, there's my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my mother, my children, and my grandchildren, and 4 influential people.
Well, that's a lot to cover in one quilt. And you also have horses, and they're important, you said, in the Navajo creation story?
Yes, they are. They're very important to us because everybody tells us that the horses came from the Spaniards and everything, but they came from our creation stories. They're the ones that they bring the time of the day that the God, he rides the horses. And when he rides that horses, whatever horse he's riding, it's going to depend on if our days are cloudy or sunny or just beautiful all the time.
Wow, very interesting. I know that you also refer to this piece, this quilt, as being ledger art. And that's an interesting story of how ledgers, I thought it sounded like old-fashioned spreadsheets, but tell us about ledger art.
Well, what happened with mostly like the Plains Indians are well known for, especially the ones that were prisoner of wars at Fort Marion in Georgia. And when you take away a person's way of life, you know, like they had the buffaloes and people would draw, and when you put them on reservations or someplace, you know, you adapt. And so they would get these ledgers and they would do the drawings on them. Little did they know that years later that they would be very valuable. And so what I did was, I've always liked ledger art, but I just can't make a straight, even a stick person. So I was challenged by a Cheyenne man. And I was like, this Cheyenne man's challenging me. I'm a strong Navajo woman. So that's what I did. So I have, with the help of Corporal Morissette, he's Chippewa Cree. He's the one that did the horses for me. And so it just went for there. I had no plans. I had no patterns. I had nothing. So it took me 8 months to do.
The second quilt that you have wanted to share with us is called 29 Warriors, and that is another interesting story of the ancestors from your Indian background.
Well, what I originally did was I wanted to write my thank you letters to my Shajays, my grandfathers, the original 29 code talkers, because when you look into the history that they were in these boarding schools and they were told that they couldn't speak our language. But in reality is when it came down for war, the time for war, they went and they served the country. They went to protect the Nipito. They wanted to protect our lands. And so they used our beautiful language to save a nation. And so this was my thank you letter to them, because millions of people are alive because of them.
Yeah, very interesting background from World War II.
Yes.
And your other quilt about the POW and MIA, the Honoring Ledger quilt, that also has background from your ancestry, and it's another ledger quilt?
Yes, it is. It's in 1864. Like I said, my 3 ancestors were taken as prisoners of war to Fort Summer, and in a couple generations later, in 1942, my 2 grandfathers, Edward and James, they became POWs. They were on the Bataan Death March, and James survived. Edward didn't.
Susan, thank you so much for sharing the stories, there are many more to share, and we're happy to have you here on Nancy's Corner. You
Okay.
can find more information about today's Nancy's Corner guest, rewatch this show online, and connect with Nancy at her website, nancyzieman.com. It's been a pleasure being the first guest host on Sewing with Nancy. Thank you for watching.
Mary Malari has written a fully illustrated book entitled Applique Large and Small, item number MP43, that serves as a reference for this series. It's $19.95 plus shipping and handling. To order the book as well as notions used during the series, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2712. Credit card or online PayPal orders only. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at nancyzieman.com to see additional episodes, Nancy's blog, and more. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Class A Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Oliso. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.